Check one. Hello. So welcome to the February Transmedia NYC /StoryCode meetup. Thanks for coming, everyone. We've got a really exciting presentation from the folks from America 2049, and we've also got we've got a number of exciting announcements. But before we dive into things, I just wanted to thank Steve Schultz, who's operating the webcam for our live stream viewers. So thank you, Steve. He's back up in the projectionist room somewhere. So first things, we launched the StoryCode.org website yesterday and are really excited about it. So here it is. Please feel free to check it out, tweet about it, and share it with your associates. The idea here is that we'll be archiving past presentations here as case studies. So there'll be hopefully a growing record and archive of some of the transmedia projects that have been presented and discussed here. We'll also be listing future events here, so we're starting to program further ahead. We actually know what's going on in March, April, and May, so we'll start to be listing this information up here as well. Last but not least, part of our efforts as a nonprofit is to earnestly start to begin to raise funds to put on some of the additional programs, such as the hackathon and some of the other programs we're planning. So we've got a sponsorship page up here, and we're going to start to be kind of reaching out to different folks. So if you know of any brands or companies that would like to align themselves with our community, definitely let us know, because we'd love to speak to them. So the next item on the list is a new set of programs that we're going to run. So every month we have the meetup, which will continue to be here, and we'll continue to have some great programming. But we're starting a track called StoryCode Immersions, and the idea here is that this is going to be a much smaller, more intimate, conversational get-together. We're going to do these on alternating 2 weeks. So the first StoryCode Immersion is going to be in 2 weeks. It's going to be up in the flex space. The flex space is where we had drinks that after the November meetup. It's right up there, room 17. So the idea here is that for the first StoryCode Immersions, it's going to be focused on technology. I'm just going to be doing a very broad stroke web architecture overview for very beginner and entry-level novice storytellers that are really looking to just have a better understanding at a high level about technology and just kind of how the web architecture is set up. Then there'll be a second part which will be featuring Aaron from Social Samba, who will be walking through a really cool tool called Saga Writer. And this is the tool that USA Network used to create the award-winning #killer story in that campaign. So Aaron will be presenting the tool itself. It's a WYSIWYG, very easy to use tool. So the idea is that these immersions are really for novice, entry-level folks, and I'll announce it on meetup.com tomorrow, but each time we have an immersion, we will explain kind of the target audience. So this is definitely beginner and novice tech level folks. And then we'll also be alternating it with business immersions. So we're going to start to talk about how to present your project, the type of materials that folks in our community have created to just kind of share these resources with you. So those are my two announcements. So thank you. So please check out storycode.org.
Okay. So the next one is everybody needs to pull out their calendars. We finally nailed down some dates for the hackathon. We're going to be doing it April 28th and 29th. We're still working on the space, but we did finally nail down the actual dates. So for those who are going to be interested in coming to the hackathon, we hope you all are. Those are going to be the days we'll be doing it. Secondly, DIY days. I think most people here know what DIY days is, and if you don't, go ahead and just DIYdays.com. It's Lance's, it's sponsored by Workbook Project, and it's at the new school, March 3rd, and we will be doing a panel there, so we would like to invite everybody to come. Make sure you sign up, come support DIY Days. It's a great event, and this year, it'll be a lot of fun, and we'll be there, of course.
All right, welcome guys. 2 years ago we were in a bar called Sweet and Vicious on Spring Street, and there were maybe 1/8 the number of people. So we're very excited upon the launch of StoryCode to be able to have you in our community join us. Most of you who've ever worked on a project, and the vast majority of you are creatives, understand what it's like to reach out to a community and build one. So look around you. This is your community. This is the community we've built around something very nascent and very awesome. When we did the Social Media Week presentation this past week, a handful of us from this community, we were really kind of amazed and overwhelmed to see what the outside world feels is important in terms of the next step in storytelling. So the launch of the site is perhaps not as exciting just thinking about the launch of a website. But it's really not about the launch of a website, it's really about the launch of StoryCode, which is an idea, a community, a place where people can go and dream of what comes next. So I know you're here so that you can participate in that dream, and so you can enhance your work and meet other people who are on the same cutting edge. So I'm glad you're able to join us. And we look forward to the future of StoryCode being exciting, an incubator for your projects so we can support you and help you move the form forward. We're here because we want to move the form forward. We don't want to stay in the past. We don't discriminate. We like marketers. We like all kinds of storytellers. We like nonprofit social good people. We like people who want to tell a good story and aren't afraid of the tools that it takes to make that happen. So I feel very, very, very excited that you are all here. And especially today we have a fantastic project that perhaps shows some of the breadth of the kinds of things that come through this group. The project is America 2049, and you may have seen it on Facebook. The presenter, one of the presenters I actually met on another panel, and she's fantastic. I met her on a panel and I thought, I got to get this woman to speak at StoryCode. And then I looked her up and I saw that she did America 2049, which is a project I really admired. So it was a lucky bonus. Mallika Dutt is the president and CEO of Breakthrough. It's a global human rights organization that uses the power of media, pop culture, and community mobilization to inspire people to take bold action for dignity, equality, and justice. Through award-winning initiatives in India and in the United States, Breakthrough addresses critical global issues including violence against women, sexuality and HIV/AIDS, racial justice, and immigrant rights. If you tweet about her tonight, her Twitter is Mallika Dutt, 2 L's, Mallika Dutt, so 2 L's and 2 D's, and 2 T's. And with her to present is Heidi Boisvert, sorry, I'll do the French one, Boisvert, is a founder and creative director of the Future Perfect Lab, a boutique creative agency that works in partnership with nonprofits to engineer their social messages for mass appeal through imaginative and playful applications of integrated media and emerging technology. As the multimedia director for Breakthrough, Heidi oversaw the production of a wide variety of new media projects that help raise awareness of pressing issues, including serving as creative director, producer, and co-game designer for America 2049. If you're going to tweet about her, you can use her handle, which is at HJBOISVERT. I'll send out a tweet so you can copy it if you want to talk about it. Anyway, without further ado, we are looking to the future, America 2049.
Thank you so much. We're thrilled to be here with all of you this evening. It's been quite a journey for us with 2049, and what we thought we'd do before we kind of dive into the details of the actual Facebook game was to give you a little bit of the background behind Breakthrough's perspective and why we do what we do, and the issue areas that led us to 2049. So, as Aina said, we are a global human rights organization, but the way we think about human rights is very different from sort of the traditional human rights orientation. For us, human rights are about what happens at home. They're about what happens with you as an individual. They're about how all of us, individually and collectively, come together to create a culture that respects dignity, equality, and justice. One of the key sort of underpinnings of our approach to human rights is that culture is an incredibly important tool, methodology, and approach to transform culture. And a lot of the violations that we care about, whether it's around immigration or violence against women or racial justice issues, are embedded in cultural practice, in normative values, in the ways in which we treat one another. So for us, human rights isn't just about what governments do or don't do. They're really about how we treat one another in our homes, our communities, our schools, our workplaces, anywhere that we inhabit. So I think you can see that given our particular approach to human rights, narrative and storytelling are absolutely critical ingredients to how we engage people. And ultimately what we want to do is transform the hearts and minds of individuals and communities so that we can transform action, so that we can all become social change actors. And what storytelling allows us to do as in the capital U.S. and allows Breakthrough to do, is sort of really begin a conversation with where people are located. You know, it really allows us to start the dialogue with you where you are, with you where you are, as opposed to kind of talking in big abstractions or talking about conventions or UN documents around human rights that really don't mean anything to anybody. So let me fast forward a little bit to the issue of immigration and racial justice in the United States. We fell into working on this issue post 9/11, so really 11 years ago, 10 years ago. And you know, our work in India has been focused on women's human rights issues, and in the US we've really looked at immigration and racial justice issues. And sort of the growing evisceration of civil rights, of human rights, of particular communities in the United States post 9/11 has been of particular concern to us. Hundreds of thousands of people in detention, being deported, deaths in detention, massive sexual abuse in detention, the breakup of families. And there's a narrative around this that focuses on undocumented people, but really the impact of 9/11 has affected immigrant communities across the board. You might have been reading recent stories about the way in which the FBI has put young Muslim college students under surveillance, for example, in the last many years. When we started trying to talk about immigrant rights and racial justice with people, we discovered like this major wall, you know, the way in which sort of the dominant narrative had othered the immigrant was just quite astounding. And so it became all about they're illegal, therefore they don't deserve rights. And so whatever one talked about in terms of fundamental human rights or constitutional protections or abuse in detention facilities or what was happening to communities or, you know, the way in which mixed families exist in this country where somebody may be undocumented, somebody may be a citizen, we just couldn't get the kind of traction and engagement that we wanted where people sort of then became a part of that story. And that dilemma of how to make the conversation about immigrants move from us versus them to all of us, and what does this mean for all of us, was really the impetus behind America 2049. So 2049 is the year that the demographic shift is supposed to take place in the United States, where we go from minority becomes majority. And in that
2049 world, we see a potential future where human rights in the United States have been completely destroyed, where we are engaged almost in a civil war, almost in an armed struggle between people who want to see a vision of a pluralistic, diverse, multiracial, multicultural world, and those that would prefer to see a more divided, more focused on sort of Caucasians being in power and everybody else get out kind of universe. In the narrative that we created, we really wanted to imbue the story with connections amongst and between issue areas. So in the story that we tell, migration is with a big M. It is about Native Americans. It is about the history of slavery. It is about Irish people. It is about Jewish communities. It is about all of the histories of migration that make up the United States, what it is today. It is also a story where we make connections around issue areas. So it is about women, it is about labor, it is about lesbian and gay and transgender and bisexual communities. It is about healthcare, it is about ethnicity, it is about race, it is about sort of all of the ways in which each and every one of us and our identities exist in this multiplicity of ways. And so in 2049 and in the playing of the game, which played out over a 12-week period when we launched it on Facebook, almost as an ARG, you will find yourself in this future of 2049 where human rights hang in the balance. And you are an agent of something called the Council on American Heritage, and you are against another group of people called Divided We Fall. And in that narrative, one of the key characters is a Ugandan American gay man who sort of plays a pretty critical role that allows us to then sort of start unpacking a lot of these layers that I just laid out to you. I'm going to hand this over to Heidi, who is going to walk you through the development of this game and how we went about building it, and the story of sort of how we built out all of the various transmedia elements that went along with what we did on Facebook. And we're going to close our piece of this conversation with both of us just kind of sitting down and having a chat with each other about what we learned along the way. Like, what are some of the things that were amazing? What were some of the things that were really challenging? Do's and don'ts for us going forward. And we hope that in that conversation, you all will just become a part of it. Because what we realized when we were coming here today is that we have an enormous amount to learn from all of you in the audience. And so we want to share the story of 2049, but we really want to turn this into a collective dialogue about how to use effective transmedia storytelling for change, which is kind of what drives breakthrough. So I'm just going to hand this over to Heidi.
Hello. So a few things before I run in. I'm going to probably map out all of the various touch points and some of the key things that are challenging in terms of creating transmedia when you're working alongside or in partnership with an NGO or a nonprofit organization working on issues, because I think those design constraints are far different. Although Frank Lance would argue with me that a good game is just a good game, but I do think there are different challenges in terms of making quote-unquote serious games. So when we first began America 2049, part of Breakthrough's ethos in terms of conceptualizing projects is that we oftentimes come up with sort of maybe 3 or 4 concepts, and then we put it before what we call a brain trust and go through what might be sort of similar but not entirely full-blown co-design process, right? So we'll bring people who are, game designers, who might work in education, who are other NGOs working on the very same issues. They might be youth, and we bring them together to get their feedback on concepts that we come up collectively in their organization. So prior to America 2049, initially when we received funding, we were going to make an interactive timeline with, we had these cultural artifacts, which were poetry, they were paintings, photographs, a whole host of things which you'll realize did get woven into the game, but in a far more exciting and engaging way. So through that process, what we discovered was that we actually had a great concept and content, but we didn't have quite the right vehicle, right? So what I started to do is analyze Facebook games and a whole host of other types of game platforms to consider how we could actually communicate the very core issues that Mallika just mapped out, right? Building bridges between diverse constituents, right? Talking about the 5 waves of migration, but in a way that's accessible and abstracted and that's infused with very strong storytelling components. So Facebook seemed to be a great place to begin with. And then adding all of the transmedia components and using Facebook as the core engine that drove the other story layers became the way in which we answered the riddle of how to communicate some of these core issue areas. So what I'm going to do now is walk through all of the various components very briefly, but I'm going to start with our trailer, which we used as a preceding campaign, and Facebook actually posted it on their, featured it on the game page. So the idea there was really just to garner a player base prior to the launching of the game, and there's a few other preceding elements, viral elements that we created.
They told me that I belong to anybody who wants me from now on. I wanted the chance to be free! To reclaim my heritage!
See, around here, they don't allow any mixing of the races like they do in looser parts of the country.
A secure government facility has been attacked. Sources tell us that at least 5 inmates have been freed. Preliminary reports allege that the attackers are affiliated with Divided We Fall, the terrorist group.
Agent, so nice to see you again. We're becoming great friends. Eyes will be watching you and judging.
If we find him, we can take out DWF from the top. It's of vital importance. Don't let us down again, Agent.
Guys like us took an oath to protect this country against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. That oath didn't die with our army.
So this received about, I guess, 54,000 hits within the first 4 days. And we also had, at the same time, created a trailhead for the ARG, which the ARG net picked up and started a wiki and whatnot. But the idea here was to create a job posting for a CA agent and then get them to go to the website to sign up. So we signed up about 2,000 names ahead of time. At the same time, we started to launch over a period of a couple of days before the game actually launched, a few other websites that related to the organizations that Mallika mapped out, the Council on American Heritage and Divided We Fall, the 2 core organizations, as other touch points. And then we had some physical objects as well, postcards to check your smart ID. The idea here was to seed little backstory components before the game actually launched. And then on the day the game launched, we sent out to those 2,000 individuals who signed up an email saying, you've been hired, your job starts now at 12 Eastern Standard Time, and then the site actually launched. And they were given this homepage here where they could press play and sign up to become an agent. First thing they were actually able to see was an agent training, which the voiceover is by Igor Vamos from the Yes Men. But you were taught a little bit about the role that you would play in the organization, as well as how to use most of the interface elements. But it was woven in a very kind of story-like way. Next, each week, as we said, the game's played out over 12 weeks, and the idea here is that we used the map. The player was in a different city in each of those weeks, and they were dealing with different human rights issues each week. For example, week 2, when we were in Chicago, we partnered with the Hull House, and we did work around women's rights issues and forced prostitution. So, but each week, Victor Garber, who's your boss, essentially, he gives you your mission for the week. And then what you're doing is you're actually navigating within the constraints of the Facebook interface, right, the API that we used, and you're clicking on these various tiles which pop up various types of multimedia content. But sort of metaphorically, what you're doing is you're speaking to your ground crew, right, in these various cities, and they pop up and offer you different clues and sort of bits of information they're picking up from locals in the area as informants and things, which come across through voiceovers. The other things you're picking up are bits of clues that are scattered, and these are coming in from your ground crew. And these are come in the form of different types of, codes and bits of information. And then at some point you have to figure out how to apply these multi-clue parts to various types of puzzles. Once you figure out the puzzle for that layer, we built them in phases for each week. So there are 3 phases, so 3 puzzles per week. And once you figure that out, you are often given some sort of reward or bonus content, which I'll get into in a moment. The other thing that was happening is there are cryptographs, which were threaded throughout. And the cryptographs for each phase were offering you foreshadowing for the narrative for the next week, right? So we were setting up narrative elements the week prior to through these cryptographs that you would pick up throughout the board. Eventually, if you figured out the cryptograph, you would plug it into this safe, and you would receive an artifact. Remember I had mentioned the artifacts prior to that we had started out with as a sort of seed for the project. But we ended up using these real artifacts as book codes almost. So we embedded little bits of clues and information. I don't know if you can see very well, but in the back it says, release the biochemist. So that's a little bit of information you would have to use in a next week. But this is an actual artifact from Kent State riots, right? So we utilized the history, but we were talking about the history sort of meta-narratively. We also, because the game takes place in 2049, we had to create a whole history, right, from 2011 to 2049. So we created fake artifacts as well through graphics, visuals, posters, a whole host of things.
Are you worried?
Sorry. And then the other thing that we have in the board that you'll encounter are fourth wall videos from the various characters who are woven into the narrative structure. And 5 of these, as you saw in the trailer, are fairly well-known celebs in more like the sci-fi realm. Harold Perrineau from Lost, for example. So I'm just going to show you a clip of, we created over 70 videos, fourth wall videos that offer little bits of narrative information, but they're also the key testimonials, which one you'll see here, which talk more deeply about the issues that we discuss each week. So this one is underscores Harold's story.
Are you worried that they broke me? Don't be. I am stronger than they can ever imagine. Weakness of the body is unimportant as long as the mind is strong. You already know I am from Uganda. I love Uganda. I miss Uganda. I miss playing cricket. I miss the lights across Kampala at night. In my country, there is no such thing as a gay pride parade. Instead, we have secrecy or an early grave. But fear cannot change who you are. I met another young man, and we became friends. We became more than friends. We were careful, so careful. But there is no such thing as a perfect secret. One day, I came home from visiting my cousin, and my mother gave me this and told me to run away as fast as I could and never again set foot in her house. It was just enough money to fly to America, some photos of my family, my passport, and a letter. Here. I translate, of course, but it says, "Beloved son, Akiki is dead, and they are looking to kill you as well. Leave now. You are dead to me now. But please understand that you will always be in my heart and in my memory." I lost my whole life that day, not just Akiki, but my mother, my grandparents, my cousins, my friends, my city, everything. I went to America. I thought it was a land of hope, but I didn't find the land of hope I was expecting. I lived 4 months in quarantine, and then I lived on the street or sometimes in jail until M. The CAH think they can break me. I've lost everything before. There's nothing worse they can do.
Okay. So as I mentioned, there's about 70. There's probably only about 10 that are more testimonial oriented that deal with the particular issue, and others are more color that offer backstory. But it was a tremendous amount of work to cut all of those. So a few other pieces, touch points within the interface itself is you'll come across these various types of book codes which offer messages and another layer of story. So you have the main story arc that takes place over 12 weeks. You have the internal story arc within each of the 12 weeks, and then you have these kind of chat threads that are woven throughout as a third layer of narrative. So some of them come through these book codes on the left-hand side there. They're red underscore. On the other side, on the right, you'll notice in this photograph, which is an archival photograph, you have some text on the bottom right from M's character, but in the left-hand side, there's a CAPTCHA code. So those CAPTCHA codes, if you plug them into Zooglio, will lead you to a chat thread between the DWF members. So you need to figure out who's communicating to who, right? And if you click on Zooglio, the actual logo there, you would go to an actual search engine. So we built a search engine that allowed you real searches through Google, as well as content from the narrative itself. So say you punched in Divided We Fall, you'd end up with a listing to go to the web page, right? So the idea was to build a search engine that had real content as well as story content to create a broader backstory. Because we couldn't do everything, what we realized there were a lot of constraints with the Facebook API. Okay, so if you got to the home page, it was kind of like a Yahoo portal. The other thing we were able to do here is another critical thing that's important to the way in which Breakthrough works, right? We oftentimes will create game or popular culture tools, but at the same time we want to create curricular or expanded elements for dialogue, right, and for further education. So through this portal, we created a whole host of kind of fake news pieces that were part of the climate of each country, each city that we were entering, as well as the stories, news stories for that week. But on the far right-hand side, I don't know if you can notice, there's two folks sitting there. We created a satirical curriculum, which I'll go to in just a moment here, kind of styled after The Onion in a way. So the idea was to create 12 episodes that related to the 12 weeks of gameplay, but that allowed us to create curriculum around it in a playful way. In the past, we had created curriculum that were more downloadable elements that teachers could use in schools, but we thought using video as a way of more of a communication starter was a more effective and interesting way to go. So these were very humorous pieces. And then two other key things were important, right? So as a nonprofit working with funders, we would like to know whether or not the work that we do is impactful, right? And that there are changes taking place. So how do we measure that? So we oftentimes work with an organization to do an analysis on whether or not the way in which we're communicating the ideas actually is translating into change in content knowledge or change in attitudes. So we built in, for two purposes, a discussion board, right? One for a more informal dialogue between players so they could problem solve together and share game content or tell somebody how to crack a puzzle. But we also were interested in the type of conversations they were having on the issue, and we seeded content in terms of the community management there. The second thing we wanted to do was build in embedded metrics for measuring change of attitude through the 12 weeks. So in the game, there's about 8 different decision points that the player has to make in terms of who they align with. Do they align with DWF, right? Or do they stay aligned with the organization that hired them into the game? But we wanted to do this in a very subtle way. So we were able to track impact that way. And then in addition to all of the other transmedia pieces that are about the game and the story itself, we created a social media architecture that rolled out content over the 12 weeks on various types of social media portals. So we had a fake web page for Kenesaba, we had a fake web page for the Jefferson character and such. And we also had a host of other web pages that were content related to different organizations or very small story threads that had fun dynamic content that changed over the course of the 12 weeks. In addition, part of what's important to our work is that we try to make a connection between digital clicktivism, right, immersion, engagement online, and how do you actually mobilize or broaden awareness or conversation offline. So we partnered with leading cultural institutions each week that mapped to the region of the country that you were in the game world. So as I had mentioned before, for the week of Chicago, the second week we partnered with the Hull House, and they had a public forum with physical people in the audience to talk about the issues. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we partnered with celebrities who donated their time to serve as some of the characters in the story with an organization called Fuel. So I'm just going to play the final PSA, and then we'll probably move to impact and more of an open dialogue.
Hi, I'm Victor Garber.
I'm Cherry Jones.
I'm Harold Perrineau.
I am Margaret Cho.
I'm Anthony Rapp.
America 2049 is a look at a future that might come to pass.
A future full of hatred.
Where our fear has overcome our desire
To do the right thing as a society.
But it doesn't have to be our future.
America is what we make of it.
Don't forget who you are
And where you come from.
Celebrate your heritage.
And celebrate the many cultures.
that have worked to build our country too.
In America, it doesn't matter where you're from.
It just matters where we're going.
Together.
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 So at the end of, this is kind of the video that you get when you finish the game, kind of the end game in a way. And at the end of the actual clip in the game, there's a URL that leads back to the Breakthrough website and Facebook page. The idea is to try to bridge or to make a connection between the impact or the decisions they're making in the fictional universe to the actual impact they could be having in our everyday lives. So we're trying to create sort of an end game scenario that makes that connection. So very quickly, there was some great mainstream media response. But more importantly, I think the players, although in terms of numbers, for us, we've created some other games like Iced where we had far greater numbers in terms of 3D games and such, and we were hoping with Facebook, right, that we have 750 million people on Facebook, that we have kind of a ready audience, but the numbers were much lower. But what we noticed in terms of player feedback is that those who stuck with it, the game is a little bit involved and complex, but those who actually stuck with it had a very deep engagement, not only with the story, but with the issues. So they were making the connections that we had intended and hoped for. So these are just some of the final impact that we've had. The game has been up over the first 12 weeks. We had those public events, and then the game was essentially like level locked each week, so you wouldn't be able to get new content until every Monday of that week. But now you can play the game kind of straight through the full 12 weeks. So from April till now, these are just sort of some of the figures. So I think what we would like to do is move to a few takeaways in terms of what we learned from the project, what we would like to do in the future, some of the things we could have adjusted to increase the numbers that we received in these sorts of things. And I think we'll do it more as an informal dialogue. And then we have a few questions for you as well. Okay. And we have some time for questions, obviously, as well at the end. Okay. So shall we just start? Yeah.
So you guys want?
I'm just going to grab this one here. Okay.
So as you can see from the presentation that Heidi just did, 2049 was one hell of an experience. I mean, it was just an enormous amount of work. It had all of these different moving parts, tiny organization. Nobody had ever done a game like this on Facebook before, so there was like no learning that we could apply to what we were experimenting with. And lots of excitement, lots of interest, lots of people like wanting to know what we were doing, how we were doing it. Lots of crazy conversations with funders who didn't understand what the hell we were trying to do. You know, all of those pieces, I mean, and as you can see, multiple websites, 70 videos, all of these celebs trying to manage all of these different moving parts, working with PhD students at NYU to make sure that all the historical artifacts were accurate, you know, like there was just a lot of stuff that went on. So one of my big learnings and takeaways from this, Heidi, and we've actually not had an opportunity to have this conversation with each other because just as we launched 2049, Madam went off to do her PhD, and you know, we've sort of been kind of doing a whole bunch of other things. But I think one of my big learnings and takeaways is that, you know, raise $1 million and then embark on something like this so that you have enough resources to do all of the moving parts, and then make sure you still have the energy and the bandwidth to make sure that you can continue to do all of the things after the game launches. I mean, one of the things that just happened to us as an organization is by the time 2049 launched, we were exhausted. And so the whole point of the game in terms of really engaging sort of this external audience and requiring all of us to be on our toes to make sure that we were out there and following up and doing all of the things that we needed to do, I don't think, you know, and combined with sort of the big transition that we ended up having to deal with Heidi, who was sort of the chief architect, also transitioning, it was a big challenge for us organizationally. So I'm going to put the question of resources on the table, you know, very, very clearly, because we have, as an organization, we're really small. We partner. Strategic partnerships are a core strategy that we use to kind of get bigger impact and bigger scale. But then I would say that, you know, do something simpler than what we attempted to do with 2049.
So we have resources on the table. I guess one of the learnings for me was I did a whole host of deconstruction on Facebook games, and I decided I did not want to make another Farmville. And so I thought, well, is there another more unique approach to utilizing this platform, right? And creating a hybrid to create an alternate reality universe through storytelling, using story to drive the gameplay, essentially. But one of my learnings, and I guess I would also throw this to the audience, is I've started to realize that the platform, that when we're accustomed to using platforms, users are accustomed to using platforms in the way in which they're intended to a degree, right? And so there's a certain degree of kind of casual engagement with Facebook and Facebook games, but at the same time, when you create a casual game, it's sort of in contradiction with deep learning, right, and deep impact in terms of sustainable change over time. So this is sort of kind of the paradox we're contending with at the moment. So I think, and the other thing one often gets into is Breakthrough is very much a learning organization. It's very innovative. It's always trying to stay sort of at the cutting edge, even with our very small resources and staff. And you know, we always want to push the technology, the emerging form, in new and exciting ways, but sometimes the audiences aren't necessarily ready for those. So I guess I would say platform choices and multiple touch points, as well as resources and complexity. Because I do think the players that played got a very deep, engaged experience. And the results in terms of the EDC report we received, 56% I think is a pretty high number in terms of people considering issues and wanting to participate actively in issues outside of the digital universe is a fair estimate. But the idea of trying to create scope with the same type of touch points that we use in maybe a more simple way, or at least starting to use the platform, or guiding people slowly to use the platform in a way they're accustomed to using it, but then sort of teasing them into trying new ways of engaging with the platform might be another approach.
If anyone has anything to add, just raise your hand and I'll toss the mic up there.
Yes.
You were just saying the platform. What's the platform? Because I don't see a platform.
So the main platform was that was used was the Facebook API, and then right, and then the websites. I mean, the search engine itself was custom designed, and it fed in. That's one other aspect, and the others were primarily WordPress sites and other social media and open source types of platforms. But the main one was Facebook. That's what I'm referencing.
And when you say Facebook, what do you mean? What was the actual Facebook? Thank you. What was the Facebook page?
Yes, the page, the main portal, which was the agent portal, where you entered and you communicated with your ground crew, that was the Facebook API. So some of the constraints that we ran into are the limitations of what Facebook games can actually do, right? I mean, certain type of clicking and this sort of thing. So how do you expand beyond that kind of clicking action?
Wow. Just listening to you exhausts me.
It exhausts me
too. Following all the details and nuances just
Believe me.
mind-boggling. So you have my sympathies. I have a couple of comments. One is I happen to be involved in and been crowdsourced into a film called the Twittermentary, which has been showed around last week and been shown around. And it's really a non-linear film that we put into a linear narrative right now, but eventually we'll go back into a non-linear film, which will allow people to kind of eavesdrop on conversations eventually. I'm involved in a project right now with a guy who spent 27 years of a life without parole sentence in prison, and he's an ex-con with convictions, which is the title of one of our projects. But the interesting point is he thinks he's involved in changing and reforming prison reform. And I think he's involved in changing the world and saying that he's a victim and he's guilty of how did he get to this position? In other words, bringing it back to him, looking at himself and saying, well, what happened to me? I'm a failure of a system, and I wound up in jail. Yeah, and my grandfather, and so he's the third of 4 generations to be incarcerated in his family, all the way from his grandfather. So we're trying to break kids out of prison before they get in. And then, one comment I would like to make, I just wanted to just plant that idea, but there's a theater of the oppressed. And what they do is they do exactly what you did in the short form, but then they come back and they have people vote and look at how they're going to take it to their legislators, how they're going to move it beyond the local conversation. I think, did you look at moving it beyond the local conversation to the legislators, those people who think they're in power?
Well, just two quick comments to what you're saying. In terms of advocacy and legislation, one of the reasons that we ended up doing 2049 is because legislation around immigration has been stymied ever since before President Obama became president. And we haven't been able to make any movement forward on fixing our very, very broken, disastrous immigration system. And so one of the things that we feel is that there's an enormous amount of emphasis that gets put on public policy and legislative change, but we believe that a lot of those things can't happen without culture change. And that a lot of times you get legislative change, but then you stop paying attention to the culture change that needs to even accompany whatever victory you have, and then you end up in a situation where we're fighting for the right to abortion in 2012, and we have Rick Santorum running around making the most absurd, ridiculous comments, and we have the Common Foundation defunding Planned Parenthood, and you're like, wait, this is the United States of America, it's 2012, and hello? This is the stuff that's in 2049, as a dystopic future, right? So for us, the focus on culture and making sure that values within culture stay alive and discussed and
debated and defended and upheld is an absolutely critical part of the story. And then we partner with groups who are doing the legislative policy stuff, but that's not breakthroughs. That's not where we put our energy and our focus. And there's no point putting time and energy into something that's not moving legislatively anyway, right?
But it might energize your audience to think that they're actually doing something to make a change.
So our thing is that there's lots of ways in which you challenge bullying or racism in your space. Like there's lots of things that each one of us can be doing in our own communities, in our schools, in terms of, you know, how people are being treated, the issue of respect, stopping violence, challenging discrimination. So that's where we put, you know, a lot of our time and energy. The other thing about games that I'll just put out there for us to think about, because we are storytellers, is that it allows you to walk in somebody else's shoes, right? It allows you to become another character. And so there's really nothing else out there that allows you to be this other thing, right? And whether it allows you to walk in the shoes of a perpetrator or a victim or just somebody who's unlike you, just that experience of being able to immerse yourself in that other, I think is an incredibly important thing for people to experience. And that's what really good storytelling is about, right? It allows you to just sort of lift yourself out of just who you are and become so many other things. And games especially, I think, really contribute that.
So we have the mic over here.
Okay.
Just curious, on the collectivism to activism part, kind of a two-part question. So you did this in Facebook, and I get the limitations of the gaming experience itself. What did you see from the metrics side, and what did the game enable in terms of using Facebook for, so I'm playing the game and I'm getting exposed to this information. Were there ways for me to push any of that information to my friends on Facebook? And then kind of related to that, the live event stuff, did you see, what sort of transition did you see in the live events? What sort of attendance, and did it match up with your participation on Facebook geographically?
Good question. So actually I had two slides I didn't share because we had a phase 2. It was supposed to be built into phase 1, one of which was the ability to add agents right at the bottom of the interface to kind of create a wider network with your friends, so you'd be playing with your friends. And there's also another tab that allows you to actually see your friends' participation online, like so-and-so has just solved this clue. And the phase 2 stuff was taking that content, you know, so-and-so just solved this, the various types of milestones, and pushing the content to the Facebook page. So the idea there was viral propagation. And because, you know, we would have waited to launch the game till these elements were ready, but we had already partnered with these amazing leading institutions and set up the offline events, so we couldn't adjust those dates because they were already planning, right? In terms of the live events, Julie, a colleague of ours, went to a number of these events across the country, and I think roughly they were lower number, I mean there were probably 150 people roughly, I'd say, at some of these events.
They were all packed. I mean,
Yeah.
they were all max capacity.
Yeah.
And a lot of the audiences that ended up going to those institutions were audiences that they had never had before.
Right,
So they
that
were
was-
thrilled because they had younger people walking in the door. And so even though there were lower numbers in the Facebook game, but it was because the room couldn't hold more than 100 people kind of thing, yeah? But there was great response, enormous response.
The other thing I'll just add about the partner organizations is each of these institutions, a number of them are government organizations that have huge bureaucracies. So in terms of getting them to be able to participate in something that they didn't actually know how it was going to unfold was a huge challenge. Because initially we had this crazy idea where like we could plant some of the artifacts in their sites and people could go to the actual institution, the museum, and find pieces they could bring back to the game. But no. So we had to lower the barrier of what our relationship, our partnership would look like, but still have a quid pro quo, right? Meaning that they would benefit by having a diverse audience, and we would benefit by getting also new audiences that would come through the museum that would see our materials and such, yeah?
Who has the mic?
So you mentioned in the in the slides that there was one point where you wanted to analyze someone's change in empathy from the company they were brought into the game from to the company that to empathize with the counter group. And it sort of goes to this question about the change in behaviors or activism. So like how many of those sort of like analysis points were you able to like build in, and did you see actual behavior changes or kind of like real world activations or empathy changes or whatever through those kind of like little gates that you set up?
Yeah. Do you want to take this?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can help me.
You know, the thing is that it was very difficult for us to measure behavior change, right? So we could do the knowledge and the attitude and various empathy points in terms of how people made decisions and why they made those decisions, but then trying to measure what happened beyond the game was really not something that we could control.
So stepping aside from that.
Right. So we saw great. I mean, there was, I have the evaluation there with me, but in order for me to read anything to you from it, I have to put on my glasses, and then I can't see anything. So, what I would highly recommend is what happens. So it was 56. 56%. But the evaluation is on our website at breakthrough.tv, so I would highly recommend that you actually get it. It's a really easy read, and it's one of the first evaluations of its kind, because it's one of the first games of its kind, and there's just enormous amounts of very interesting data in there, including a lot of comments from the forums and what people were actually saying and how they were dealing with one another. The other thing that was really interesting for us is that in terms of the 20,000, and we don't know what all of the numbers are now. I mean, there's like we're adding about 1,000 a month, just in terms of a sort of a growing thing, and we're not really doing any outreach around it, but it's almost like 50-50. But more women filled out the pre and post evaluations, but more men commented in the forums, right? Now, those are the kinds of observations that we can make, but what does that actually mean in terms of a greater significance? We don't know. But it was really interesting to us to see that in terms of the sex of people playing, that we had an almost 50-50 balance.
I guess I'll just add, so I worked with EDC to develop the evaluation kind of criterion, and we were targeting 3 particular things which we hadn't in past evaluations for previous games we made, and it was based on more of a very kind of complex Vygotsky model that looked at kind of ethical decisions that were made as well. So because they're around the decision points were around kind of pivotal plot points, we were looking very closely at ethical decisions, but we also broadened the scope to evaluate the discussion forums, which is why I shared that in terms of the types of conversations that were happening around the issues more informally. And then the third thing I will just mention is that the artifacts themselves, the evaluator was very keen to understand what the connection was between how people were reading the actual artifacts and what they were understanding about the contextual history that they were embedded in the story. So in the report, I think you can download it. It's pretty robust analysis. One of the things I think in terms of learnings that more actively monitoring, seeding content in community forum may have created more give and take, sort of creating almost characters as an organization that were seeding fake content to get a provocative conversation happening, might have, I think, added to the type of dialogue around the issues.
And one other big takeaway from the evaluation was that, in the gameplay, you got to make choices, but the game actually just followed one narrative, right? So everybody ultimately ended up doing the same thing, even if you made different choices. And a lot of people really wished that had been different, that the gameplay had allowed them to actually become the bad guy, or, follow through on their choices within the game. And that was something that we wanted to do, but it was very difficult to do, A, in terms of the Facebook application, and B, in terms of just the resources that were required to actually, follow that through, right? Yeah. But that was something that came up as a major piece in the evaluation.
Quickly, you said it was a Vygotsky model. Will you spell that?
Vygotsky.
Will you spell that for me?
Oh, shoot. Yeah, and I have a PhD. Just kidding. Bygotsky.
Thanks. Now, my question is, as it pertains to preaching to the choir, what did you do to lower the barrier to get dissenting opinions to play the game and to keep them from walking away at the first, liberal, feely good kind of moment in the game?
So I want to do a nice shout out as well to Andrea Phillips, whom I haven't mentioned, and she's a genius, and I don't know, many of you probably know her, but I sought after her to work on the narrative for the game, and she also worked very closely in terms of like the game design, experience design components. And the reason I was interested in working with her was because I thought it was critical, based on the message of Breakthrough, that we try to abstract some of the issues that we're contending, but also to build a story, a narrative that you could just get engrossed in, and that you were sort of surreptitiously participating in the issues without realizing it, right? So we set up the narrative, right? The way in which Andrea set up the narrative was that we started sort of favoring and working with Council on American Heritage, thinking that you're doing the right thing and that you're set up with a certain set of values, and you start to question your values, but as a character working for this organization. So things are not they happen, the narrative arc, I guess, or sort of that turning point, that peripetaya, in a way happens only in week 7, right? So you don't really realize, you start to question, like the video you saw with Asaba, for example, happens, I believe, in week 8. But he contacts you throughout, just starting to get you to start questioning what you're doing, and so you start kind of debating. But I think having the budget or the resources to create more emergent potentiality would have enhanced some of that, yeah? So, I mean, we work on, if the players decided they wanted to blow up the universe, we were open to that, even though we're a human rights organization, right?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time kind of really grappling with that issue, and we just didn't have the resources to really pursue that line of thinking, which is why I started out with, raise the $1 million first and then embark on these things.
To what extent, if any, was there an attempt to enroll the players of the game to continue to have some kind of a dialogue or a relationship with you and your organization and the kinds of things you were trying to achieve that went beyond the game, a continual relationship with these people?
Do you mean during gameplay or at end game?
At end game, like now,
Okay.
like after the game is over.
So we really encouraged people to join our Facebook community, to join the Breakthrough mailing list. We send periodic emails to them when there are action points that are emerging that we want them to do or take part in. So we continue to engage with the community of people that did sign up. Not all 20,000 people that sort of played the game have done that. So, and I can't remember what the exact number is. There were definitely several thousand. One of our big challenges is that creating sort of the online space in which people continue to function as community in the way in which social media is fragmenting, and as well as mobile is sort of emerging as a critical place for dialogue and conversation. It's been, again, sort of both a technology and resource challenge to keep staying on top of like all of the ways in which those things are happening. And that's a big conversation that we're having internally, because we also have a huge community of people that we are working with in India. And now we're moving into Nepal and China and Bangladesh. And this game was played by people from more than 20 countries. So it's not even just that we're dealing with sort of a US constituency, we're suddenly dealing with this global constituency. And so the question that you're asking is something that we're really trying to get better at answering, because we didn't start out thinking about ourselves as a global community.
But I do think, like initially, I mean, part of why I chose to share the PSA at the end, and the idea there in terms of an end game was to story-wise, sort of transition agents to become agents in the real world, right? And I think this is something in terms of massaging how that still happens in terms of the communication channels. Do they continue to receive certain types of content that's story-specific, right? Or is that would require a whole team of people? We have 7 people in the U.S. office, right, to actually produce new content to keep that going. But the idea would have been to create a clearer connection, kind of like Conspiracy for Good. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that project, right, the Tim Crean project. But to create actual actions that relate to still kind of mission-based dynamics that occurred in the game. I mean, I think that would be like a next step if we had the staff, the capacity.
So a couple of things. One is you went first, and you created something that's a great legacy. It sounds like you've debriefed and been evaluated, so all of us will appreciate the courage and the dedication that you've put into getting it this far.
Thank you.
Thank you. 2 is you've talked about the resources, the budget, and you referred to the figure $1 million. What was the actual cash outlay? 1. 2, then it sounds like there's an awful lot of organizational man hours, people hours that went into this. Has anyone calculated that? Trying to get a sense of what was produced for how much money.
I think, well, the original
I'm sorry.
budget...
One more thing was, where'd the money come from?
Are we allowed to say that? I'm just kidding. I think the original budget that we had raised was, I'm pretty sure we exceeded this, was $267,000 for the project-specific budget. But I don't know what the final figures were. And that was the budget I had to work with. And so, we did a lot of, this is for a good cause. Please work with us, create the momentum. It was a great collaborative effort and team that really started to care about the project. So I think we got to do a lot more with the limited resources that we had.
We are supported by a number of foundations and individual donors, and they include Ford and the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, smaller human rights funders like Overbrook, Libra. We're pretty transparent about all of this, and they're all on our website. So if you really, and then there's a whole bunch of people who fund our work in India that are different, including the Dutch government and all of that. And then we have individual donors who support our work that really are very critical to us being able to experiment and things like that. We haven't actually done the calculation that you just asked us in terms of actually looking at the people hours in terms of staff and just everything that we did. And also what we haven't done is allocated dollar figures to all the free pro bono support that we got, right? So in terms of all of the celebs, all of the videos that got made, I mean, we had all of these people coming in and doing free voiceovers in our office. It was really quite an enormous enterprise. I mean, all the students who did the research at NYU, I mean, if I actually start thinking about it, we probably spent over $1 million. And I'm saying $1 million really as I'm just pulling that, I'm using that actually very facetiously, because most commercial video games have budgets that are upwards of $25 million, right? So we're looking at, $50 million, $75 million. We're talking a completely different level of resources, right? But it isn't just the resource issues that we've learned lessons from. Like I said, I think trying to make people on Facebook do things that they weren't necessarily inclined to do. Maybe doing fewer things, but figuring out a way to make more of this immersive storyline, which allowed people to go off on different tracks. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that I think we would do differently if we did another game. There's also enormous learning from our first video game, which was Iced, which was the first 3D online game. And we also have that evaluation on our website if you're interested in looking at kind of like that whole story. And that got played by over 180,000 people and just generated huge amounts of media discussion and debate and dialogue. So just pointing you to that as well.
Can
Can you talk a little about the promotional strategy behind the game? My perception of ARGs is that they tend to emerge kind of surreptitiously from players discovering them. And although I didn't play this game, my perception at the time, I was aware of it, and it came out the gate really strong. There was a really strong, I remember one day when it appeared in all my feeds of those press that had been briefed very carefully, and they were talking about the celebrity involvement. Can you talk about what part that played as opposed to letting this game just kind of bubble up from players?
Actually, there was a little bit of both. So we went with a dual strategy. So we did do a kind of 5-week prior to preceding viral campaign where we launched that YouTube video trailer, as I mentioned, and some of the other breadcrumb pieces, right? So there was that trickle effect, and the ARGnet did pick it up, and they created a wiki, and they found all of the various sites very quickly, and in fact I had to hide a bunch of stuff because they were too fast for me. But then we also did the traditional route. And in the past for other projects, we created sort of like a templated approach where we do mainstream outreach. We create an A&R, a VNR package, a whole press kit and all of that sort of thing. So we do the traditional thing. Although with this one, we didn't do the radio as much as past projects, I would say. And then we also have a pretty sizable blogger outreach effort. And the idea there initially was that we were going to do it in a more surreptitious kind of playful way to get bloggers to contribute content and to play up this idea that this fictional universe actually existed, but then they kind of got lost with that. So we ended up sending them more of a traditional blurb approach. So we have that kind of like, non-traditional, I guess, approach in terms of social media, bloggers, and all of that. And then we also do the more mainstream strategies. So. So yeah, so this is the other thing. So the one other thing, that distribution model thing there is there because one of the things we tried to do, and we had some bites and folks were going to do some stuff for us, was that we wanted to get corporate sponsorship. So initially, if you saw on the Zuglio page, there were all these fake ads for some of the products that exist in the game world. But the initial idea was to feed in sort of future ads, right, from corporations that would buy media so that we could get a more elaborate marketing budget. And so we had orchestrated some conversations with a group, and then that didn't really quite come into fruition. But we had some really inventive ideas around that, and we even have a store for the game, and there were a whole host of other approaches, but we did not have a media buy budget.
So my question is right here. In terms of the engagement piece, there have been a couple of comments and sort of been back and forth about keeping people engaged with the game and with the concept and with you afterwards. Have there been any attempts at encouraging people to create their own content as a means to continuing that kind of engagement rather than having you all on the hook to, to continue to pump things out? Has there been any thinking or strategy around enabling the players to kind of take it out on do their own thing with it, run with it?
I know what we wanted to do a sequel, but then Mallika had a heart attack. No, but there were some ideas floating around. In fact, the way that we designed, we worked with Doug's team, and the idea for the back end, it's flexible enough actually to offer user-generated content as submissions, but not so much as them adding content. But the idea of crowdsourcing new story material and then sort of feeding that in because there's a cliffhanger at the end. In fact, I mean, the story is quite open. At the end, it could go in many directions. So that's a fantastic idea. Can we steal it? And then you also had some ideas around media and like television. Do you want to talk about that at all? You and Bridget?
We had a million ideas. And, we're still trying to figure out some of these pieces. We got the evaluation just a couple of months ago, and I think that, just again, organizationally, there's some big decisions that we're trying to make around where we really focus our energies, because in addition to this, we do video stories of people affected by detention and deportation. We have this whole other campaign called Restore Fairness. We're working with a bunch of immigrant high school kids in Queens around this other project called I Am This Land, where they're all using different media techniques to tell their own stories, and a whole bunch of their stories are going to get picked to get animated. And then we have this huge campaign calling on men and boys to take a stand against domestic violence that has like reached 130 million people and is now running around into all of these other countries. And so we're just trying to like step back from all of this stuff and just figure out where are we putting our energies and where are we going to focus. And so 2049 has just, it's because it's one of the many balls in the air. And what we really want to do, and we'd love advice and partnership and whatever, is we want to figure out how we build sort of a human rights core, a place where everything that we're doing ultimately feeds and rests, right? So that whether you come to breakthrough through 2049, or whether you come to breakthrough through our Ring the Bell campaign, or whether you come to us through I Am This Land, that there's the human rights narrative core that you ultimately land up in and that you become a part of that community. So that we're not having to sustain all of the storylines that go with, calling on men and boys to challenge domestic violence and getting people to take a stand against detention and deportation and what's happening to immigrants sort of in our system, right? And that's really our big challenge, is kind of what is that core? What is that human rights core that we create? So that's kind of a big answer to some of the questions that you're asking.
So I don't like to start sentences with, I think we can all agree, but I think we can all agree that this is a transmedia success story. And as someone who is sort of delving into this medium or multitude of mediums, in the last, year or so, without $1 million to back myself up, or the projects that I'm working on, what advice would you have to someone who is starting out in this area in order to get their campaigns, if you would call them that, or ideas or concepts off the ground?
So I just spent 2 months with the team in India, and now we're having this whole conversation with the team here and sort of actually trying to figure out some of the answers to the question that you just asked. And I'll tell you the formula that we've come up with, and I don't know if that's going to be helpful to you, but I'll just tell you kind of how we're going to try and go about doing this in the future. So our formula, our acronym for it is same-sex SAM. And same-sex SAM stands for the following. SAM is simple, actionable, and measurable. So whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that we're going to do going forward, is going to be simple, it's going to be actionable, and it's going to be measurable, right? So SAM's going to be our best friend. The same-sex part of it is scale, sustainability, and exit. So the question of scale is about how big do we want this to be, and what constitutes success for us in terms of scale. But that's all about who's the community, what are you trying to change, who are you trying to reach, why, all of those kinds of things. But be clear about that. Sustainability goes to many of the questions that you have asked us. What are you thinking about in terms of your post-launch actions to sustain whatever it is that you seed and whatever it is that you create? And if you haven't thought about your sustainability questions before you actually launch, then all of a sudden you're kind of in the space where you're out there, and what are you going to do? And the EX part is exit. And so what is your exit strategy? When do you look at something and say, okay, great, done, time to leave this and go do something else versus stay involved? And for us, exit as an organization can be a geographic, are we going to walk out of a particular state in India? Or it could be an issue area, or it can be a particular campaign or a particular project, right? So for example, if we were to step back and look at 2049 through the lens of same-sex SAM, there's a whole bunch of things that we might have done differently. I don't know if that's helpful at all. to you in terms of, as you think about transmedia pieces, I think that partnerships are absolutely critical. Really getting people to be on board, whether it's in the creative space, in the production space, in the dissemination space. Partnerships are just so important, and I don't think we really recognize sometimes how much time and energy you need to put aside in terms of when you're developing something to create those kinds of partnerships. So that's the other thing that I would really kind of uplift and uphold. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I guess by a show of hands, I mean, are many of you working with social justice issues? Or are you primarily from the commercial sector in terms of thinking about this from an advertising, PR, marketing type of background? So I guess that would determine the way in which I would address the question.
It's a mix.
Yeah.
So address both.
Okay. So I guess one of the key things that I've been thinking a lot about, there are two key things, but one is that top part. And as I mentioned at the outset of when I began to speak, I think one of the key constraints is trying to figure out this balance, because working in the the games for social change community or social impact games or serious games, whatever you call it, I think part of the key challenge is getting, perhaps getting more commercial entities on board to work in conjunction with nonprofits so we can maintain, more highly slick content, have greater access to distribution so that the project can reach greater numbers of people. So I think this balance is the most difficult thing for me to figure out when thinking about not only in terms of the content, right? Because what ends up happening typically is you might get a commercial entity on board and they're willing to work with a nonprofit, but a lot of education has to go into that project in terms of getting them to understand the issues and the way in which they're sensitive to the nuances of that issue, and they don't water it down to a degree, but at the same time, they don't hit people over the head with the content, right? So oftentimes what typically has happened in the past, the kind of history of Games for Change, is that you either get very thin content in terms of issue area or substance and highly produced project, right? In terms of all of the touch points, even if it's a 3D game in terms of graphics and all of this is wonderful, but the content is very thin. On the other hand, you end up, if you start with the NGO and they have a great idea, they're like, oh, I heard games are a great way to kind of affect a more diverse, a younger audience, right? We can reach beyond the choir. Oftentimes what happens is in terms of, there isn't knowledge in terms of game design and sort of how systems work and how creative teams need to be put together, right? So what ends up sometimes happening is, I used this example the other day, is that you get kind of like a driving a racing game and then you add a PSA at the end of it, right? Like the PSA that we had at the end of the game, just kidding. But so the thing that we need to figure out is how do we bring, innovative organizations like Breakthrough together with creatives, right, that have the access in terms of resources, programmers, designers, and those sorts of things, but so we can make a really substantially engaged project, right, that has the issues but is also fun, right, that we figure out what that balance is, because that will increase the impact, right? So, yes.
Okay. So you mentioned that the resourcing was a big problem for you guys. So I'm curious, have you guys looked into crowdsource funding sites like Kickstarter that are very popular with nonprofits? I'm actually surprised that nobody mentioned that.
Yeah, I don't know why we did. I mean, we are very familiar with that, since it started actually. But I think for this particular project, we had a lot of funding initially, and then I don't know why we didn't go that route. You haven't gone that route yet, right?
No, we did for something, but I can't remember what.
Oh. Huh. Yeah, because that Double Fine project right now, really cool. Have you guys seen it? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know organizationally. I mean, I don't think we've had, I haven't been part of that conversation, so I don't.
I think that, in terms of looking at the crowdsourcing and the Kickstarter piece, the people who've been able to raise like the $1 million, $2 million kinds of resources are people with names, people with following. If you look at people who've been trying to raise money for docs and kind of other kinds of things, it hasn't been that much. When I
also all of this kind of came into being way more recently, and we started working on this 3 years ago. So it wasn't like, that was an option back then. It's certainly something that we will try and use going forward. But the reality in the gaming world right now is that it's become so big. Games are probably bigger than movies now as an industry, that budgets for trying to create the kind of impact that you want out of gaming in the social justice arena are in a whole other stratosphere. And so from where I sit as a nonprofit, I don't know if we'll do another game, honestly. I just don't know if it makes sense. There's other creative ways in which we can be doing the work that we do, right? I mean, we do a whole bunch of things. I'm just not sure that, even though games for change and serious games are emerging as a big field, I'm just not sure what our impact can be in a world that is populated by, the really big games that are out there, or then sort of the Farmvilles and the Cityvilles and the whatevers of the world. The other thing is that all of this is trending mobile, right? Mobile is really where all of this is going to move. And so we have to kind of figure out, as NGOs, as human rights organizations, as social justice organizations, kind of what that means in terms of games, or the way in which we carry our social justice messages forward in engaging and creative and innovative ways.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I just want to thank again Steve Schultz from Movable Feast for taking care of the live stream. Thanks, Steve.
And we want to thank our hosts who aren't here tonight, the Film Society of Lincoln Center, who are watching on live stream even though they're not here. So thank you all for coming. Do keep tabs on the website because, for example, the tech immersions and the business immersions are designed to help us deal with some of the things that they're talking about. So we hope to bring folks like this in to help us get deeper into how to solve these problems. That is what we're here for. StoryCode is here to help you with your project. So please check the website, see what we're offering, and thanks again for coming and making it another awesome night, and thanks to you guys again.
We're going to be hanging out at the cafe, which has its liquor license, so if anyone wants to grab a beer or some wine, we'll be up there.